at its heart, it's not a complicated process, but it's made out to be, and it shouldn't be that way. So all of these things are a kind of big push in my mind, or at least permitted development is a big pull towards using it rather than the planning permission, because it gets really messy very quickly if you don't really know or know how to navigate the process very well. One of the first reasons why you want to try and avoid planning permission in the first instance is inconsistency. And that's inconsistency across councils, but also within councils for people applying for the same development. You know, sometimes people apply for things like changes of use or rear extensions or a new commercial building. It will go through swimmingly, and then someone else will apply for the same thing and they'll get into all sorts of planning struggles. And it'll go to appeal and get refused and things like that, and it'll just take forever. And that's a huge turn off for a lot of people, because there's just no knowing of how your application is going to turn out if you go through the planning process. The other one is inconsistency across councils. Across the country, there's different priorities across the country. So sometimes there's councils that have issues with areas of outstanding natural beauty, or sometimes some are more hot on sustainability, or if you're in inner London, there's always transport issues. And also different councils require different contributions, financial contributions, normally attached to like a Section 106 agreement. That varies hugely across councils, and that can make developments really expensive in one council versus another. So the inconsistent nature of how the planning process is dealt with across different councils is a huge turn-off for people. The other big turn-off of trying to get planning permission is time. There really is no knowing how long your application might take. Even if you're applying for the most simple, smallest development like a rear extension that can't be dealt with under PD, or if you're or anything from a tiny application through to a major, the time scales for your application really is a lottery. I mean, the government does put pressure on councils to make sure all of their decisions are made on time, and they put some councils in what's called special measures if they're not making decisions on time. However, council's way around that is to negotiate with an applicant to say, would you be happy if a decision gets provided on this date, which is normally, I don't know, sometimes 6, 7, 8 weeks after the actual original determination date. And of course people are always going to accept it, because they get all excited that they're actually going to get a decision, so of course they accept it, and it probably is a smart decision to accept it. But the point is that the 8-week deadline that generally speaking used to be the norm is long gone. 2.5 months minimum, so 10 weeks minimum I'd say on most applications, and so the time on getting planning permission really is a massive turn off for going through the planning process as opposed to using permitted development. The other reason is that the fate of your application is in someone else's hands. I've kind of alluded to this earlier with the inconsistent nature of it, but if you've done all your research and you're so sure that what you've done is correct, ultimately a planning officer is going to take it. And that's the other inconsistent nature about authorities. It really does depend on what officer you get, and that can really affect the outcome of your application. Now ultimately all applications generally speaking do go through managers, and there's a kind of consistent nature of decision making through that process, but ultimately the fate of your application is in someone else's hands. Unlike PD, where it's black and white, you can do this, you can't. When you're going through the planning process, all of a sudden you think you've done the best work you can to make sure you've given yourself the best chance of getting planning permission, but then you're handing it over to the council and hoping and clinging on really tight to hope that you get planning permission. But that does change across different councils depending on what officer you end up getting. So that is a tricky one to deal with, and it's a really inconsistent nature of the planning process, and it does drive a lot of people mad when they get different planning officers treating their applications in different ways. The other big turn off is financial contributions through the planning process. Even in an authority that I've been a planning officer in, the contributions for affordable housing when their new local plan was adopted changed dramatically overnight by the time that their new local plan was adopted, and that's a really big thing. So when you're doing your research into where you'd like to secure planning permission for something, or where you'd like to develop an area, do your research into what financial contributions you might be liable to, because they really are significant. some things like affordable housing, for instance, in inner London authorities is massive, really, really big. The other thing is like transport contributions for kind of pedestrian and cycling improvements, sustainability contributions, like I said, construction management plans. And the more stuff that gets put in the Section 106, the more complicated it gets. So do your research into what the financial contributions might be for that authority, because they can really, really impact the viability and the cost of your proposal. And one of the last things is that when you apply for planning permission through different authorities, you have to comply with the different adopted policies within that authority. And they can, like I've said already, they can vary massively. So all these things put together can really affect the fate and certainty of your application. So the time it takes, the cost of contributions and things like that, the fate of your application is in someone else's hands, the inconsistency of decision making across different councils, but also inconsistency of decisions within the councils. And then you've got to comply with the planning policies. So, all of these things add up to a really, what is at its heart, it's not a complicated process, but it's made out to be, and it shouldn't be that way. So all of these things are a kind of big push in my mind, or at least permitted development is a big pull towards using it rather than the planning permission, because it gets really messy very quickly if you don't really know how to navigate the process very well. And if you want the inside track on how to get planning approval for any type of development that you want to do, click the link below to download your free guide to get the 6 steps it takes to get planning permission for anything you want to do. So the top 10 projects that you can do without planning permission, these are in no particular order. But we'll start with Class MA permitted development. Class MA permitted development allows you to change commercial buildings to residential with no limit on how many residential units you can get. It's just about how big that commercial building might be. Now, all of these projects that you can get without planning permission are all linked to a document called the General Permitted Development Order, and that lists a whole bunch of different types of development that you can do. And it is bigger than it's ever been. The amount of development that you can do now is just humongous compared to what you could do before. So Class MA permitted development is a huge thing. It gets a lot of popularity. I'm sure you've probably seen a few videos on it. Allows you to change commercial to residential, and that's anything within Class E. So that includes retail, standard office, gyms, and lots of other things. So have a look at what Class E includes, because there might be a building that you've seen that falls into Class E that may well benefit from changing use to residential through permitted development. Class G is very similar to Class MA. Class G allows you to change a commercial building to mixed use, keeping the ground floor to commercial and then changing the upper floors to up to two residential units. Now, I've done a video on this before, and the conditions on using Class G are there's a lot fewer conditions than there are for Class MA, and I think the barrier to entry for using Class G is a lot lower. So yeah, Class G is a great use of permitted development. So number 3 is rear extensions. Now the opportunities for rear extensions are much higher than they used to be. You can now extend your property 3, 4, 6 or 8 meters depending on whether you're a terraced or detached property, and also depending on whether you're in a conservation area or not. And this is massive. I mean, if you can extend your property up to 8 meters, that's a huge amount of development, even, depending on how wide your property is. So simple residential alterations now, almost all of them are wrapped up into the general permitted development order, and it's a really great opportunity for people wanting to extend their homes and don't want to go through the planning process. Number 4 is outbuildings. You can build an outbuilding separated from your property, provided that it is incidental to the enjoyment of your dwelling house, which is basically a protection to stop people building in their back gardens and turning it into a flat or a house or a self-contained dwelling. But it's a really great opportunity to create things like home offices or home gyms or anything like that, even a swimming pool, and you can do it under permitted development. The next one is side extensions. You can extend your home no more than 50% of the original dwelling house. So if you add the rear extensions that I've just mentioned and the side extensions, you're talking about a huge amount of floor space that you can add under permitted development, all while you don't need to go through the whole planning process, which is a huge thumbs up. So number 6 is part 20 of the General Permitted Development Order that was added quite recently, and this was a real kind of addition to respond to the issues around the supply of housing around the country. So you can now add 2 stories onto most different types of buildings, commercial or residential, for new flats, and it's a huge opportunity for people to add a huge amount of value and scale and floor space to their properties without having to go through the planning process. Now, there is a prior approval process which is different to the planning process. It's just more black and white. There are things you have to do, yes, but it's a lot more black and white than the whole planning process is, and it's a lot easier to navigate through than having to negotiate with officers and having that whole uncertainty about where your application might go. And similarly to part 20, class AA, which is a class to extend and alter your dwelling houses or houses, you can add up to 2 stories on your own property, provided, unlike part 20, it's only for your own property, so you can add up to 2 stories but for floor space only. Now, if you wanted to use the planning process after to subdivide your house and turn those 2 stories into flats, that's up to you. But using permitted development, you can go up to 2 stories using class AA. So I'll just rattle off these last 3. Changes of use: you can change a house into a small HMO and vice versa. You can add roof extensions, so things like dormer windows, and you can also, if you're in kind of a commercial developer and you know of a it's called a class B8 use, a storage or distribution use, using permitted development you can now change the use of that to residential.